all for coming out on this kind of chilly but a little bit warmer January morning. We are excited to have you here for our 9th annual History Detectives, and a special shout out to those in our overflow room. I'll kind of turn around and wave hi. They're pretty awesome. And with that, we're just going to dive in and get started. So I'm going to invite Joellen up. She's from the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council, and she will introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie, and I welcome you to the History Detectives collaboration on behalf, as Julie said, of the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council. Not the commission, the roundtable, the society, but the council. And next month we will partner with the club, the Grand Rapids Study Club, to highlight a topic in African American women's history. We are dedicated to ensuring that omission in past histories is rectified and the role of women builders of our community is recognized. So stop at our table in the hall for more information. Today, we are delighted to have Scott Bultmann, expert in early childhood development and the German invention of kindergarten. Scott will shine a light on pioneering Grand Rapids club women who could recognize a good idea and then invest in it. In this case, in the radical 19th century idea of kindergarten. An award-winning toy designer and toy collector, Scott has good kid sense, but not content with making toys, first in his family business Uncle Goose, then in Red Hen, taking up the battle against the cyber world. Scott wrote The Paradise of Childhood, directed Foible Foundation USA, and currently is creating a documentary film on the place of kindergarten in the mutating story of the American school system. Actually, his will be the first documentary on the Froebelian history of kindergarten, one of the oldest, largest, and most influential institutions in childhood education. Here's Scott.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm Scott Bultmann. I'm a history detective, but a reluctant history detective. As Joellen explained, I grew up in the toy business. My father started manufacturing alphabet blocks in the early 1980s. My younger brother and I were indentured servants until we were able to escape to college. I got a degree in film video. I really expected to make films, but my father passed away about a week and a half after his 48th birthday. So my brother and I were still in our 20s when we took over. And about 4 years into that, one of my sales reps came to our factory, which is almost unheard of. She brought this box of blocks, and they were just plain wooden blocks. And she said it was a $200 set of blocks, and she wanted us to make them because the Frank Lloyd Wright people wanted to sell it because Frank Lloyd Wright had been given this set by his mother, and that made him a great architect, and people wanted the blocks. And I asked, am I going to sell a lot of these? And she said, no. And so, my job was creating products, and my brother, the engineer, his job was to have to make all the stuff that I came up with. So I thought I was going to do my brother a solid and turn this one down. And before I could even get the sentence out, my brother stopped and said, "No, we'll do it." And I thought, okay, well that's great. He'll take the responsibility. And then she turned to me and said, "By the way, you're going to have to write a book that goes with the set." So I went to Breton Village. I went to Baker Bookhouse, and when I got there, this book was in the window. And I walked in and I said, I think I want that book in the window. It's about Froebel Kindergarten. She said, "Oh, did you hear the author? He was on NPR today. What a fascinating story." And I thought, well, I'm the only one that doesn't know about Froebel Kindergarten, right? So I went down to the library. And as I'm looking through, there wasn't a whole lot of books on it. There were a few, but it turned out that Grand Rapids had a Froebel Study Club in the late 1890s. And I thought, well, this is fascinating. So I went to the collections person and I said, can I take a look at these materials? And she said, well, here's your white gloves. Here's this box. So I'm looking through. I'm fascinated by it. And not too long after that, I got a visit from Gordon Olson, who was the city historian, now the former city historian. And he brought me a box. And in that box was the complete annual reports from the Grand Rapids Kindergarten Association. Apparently it was a much bigger deal than I thought. And he said, we have multiple copies of these. I'm so glad that somebody is taking up this study of kindergarten. And then he began to tell me his story. So what had happened was his very first assignment when he got a job at the Grand Rapids Museum was to go and visit Clara Wheeler. Clara had started the Grand Rapids Kindergarten Association, but the interest in Clara was that her father, Reuben Wheeler, was the first architect in the city of Grand Rapids and had designed a lot of important buildings. So that was his focus, and when he got there, all she wanted to talk about was Froebel Kindergarten, and he kind of wanted to stay on topic. So he got all the stuff related to Reuben Wheeler and brought it back, and the Froebel stuff went to the Bentley Historical Library in Ann Arbor. So that visit that day from Gordon was a little bit of a karmic debt, and he's been a supporter ever since of what I'm doing. And now you understand my karmic debt, because this is now my responsibility. So I'm going to give you a little context about kindergarten first before we dig into the details about Grand Rapids. Let's see if I can. So a lot of people don't realize that there was a beginning for kindergarten. Kindergarten was invented about 200 years ago. Up until that time, you kind of had two choices if you were a child. There was just flat-out survival, or if your parents were well-to-do, you might get a hoop and a stick, and that was about as good as it got, unless you were, uber wealthy. But children were not considered full adults at that point. They were considered, you had to wait. So education didn't really start until you were in your teens. You were apprenticed off. And you might learn a trade, or you might eventually, if your parents are wealthy, go to a college or a university, but it was not for most people. And then along comes Friedrich Froebel. He was born to a Lutheran minister in a rural part of southeastern Germany, the Thuringian Forest. His mother died when he was an infant. He was the youngest of 8 or 9 children. And so he grew up playing mostly by himself in the woods, ended up becoming apprenticed to a forester, was a naturalist. He went to university to study architecture, and while he was there, he became the lab assistant for the man that invented crystallography. So that's just a part of it. He also fought against Napoleon in the war, just an incredible amount of things. But towards the end of his university career, he ended up becoming a tutor to a wealthy family and began to really get interested in education. And about 200 years ago, in earnest, he began to develop kindergarten. By the way, that's probably what he looked like. This is the Milton Bradley version. Milton Bradley tried to kind of Brad Pittify Froebel because he didn't think that women were that interested in that. So during Froebel's lifetime, some of his teachers came to the United States. The main person was Caroline Frankenberg. She settled near Columbus back in the 1840s. She had a really tough existence, but one of the interesting things that Froebel did with kindergarten was he recognized that women were the first teachers, right? So when your child is born, the mother is going to be the first teacher of the child. And so he used women in the kindergarten, which was a very radical concept at the time. In fact, in 1851, the German government outlawed kindergarten. They felt that it was a socialist plot because he was educating boys and girls together, and he was educating the rich and the poor together, and nothing good can come of that. And so they outlawed kindergarten, and within about a year, he was in his 70s at that point, the stress of his entire life's work being made illegal, he passed away. So it was people like Caroline Frankenberg spreading the word to the rest of the world that really kept kindergarten alive. Let's see if I might need some help advancing this. There it goes. Oh, back up. Back up one. There it goes. One of the main proponents was a woman named the Baroness, for in shorthand, the Baroness Bertha von Meyerholtz von Bülow, the great-grand aunt of Klaus von Bülow, if you know who that is. She spoke apparently 8 languages, and she moved through a lot of the royal courts of Europe. She spent a lot of time with the Rothschilds, and those are the people that really got inspired by the Froebel Kindergarten. Oh, there it goes. In this country, it was Elizabeth Peabody of the Peabody sisters. One of her brothers-in-law was Horace Mann, and Nathaniel Hawthorne was another. So she was part of Boston High Society. She gave a talk in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Milton Bradley and his father were there. And as they were leaving, Milton Bradley writes in his autobiography, as they were leaving, Milton turned to his father and said, "I found my calling for the rest of my life." And when I read that, I knew that that's kind of what had happened to me as well. Back it up just. Am I doing this or are you helping me? Okay, good. So Milton is kind of interesting. He made a comment and he said he never made any money in the Froebel Kindergarten business. But what's fascinating is that this was really the dawn of educational toys. This is where the school supply market came from, because kindergarten really got people thinking about educating young children. And of course, Froebel wasn't really about young children. His real goal was design education, but we'll get to that a little bit later. But when people saw what he was doing, he was working with 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And as soon as people saw the results of that, everybody got really excited. And Milton Bradley really led the charge. Okay. So I'm not sure how well this will come through. A lot of the photos that we have are scanned out of old, very small newspapers and magazines. One of the things that Froebel did was he invented the sand table. There's so many fascinating things that came out of it, but children were playing with these little blocks, and if you see a lot of photos like this, one of the things that I'd like to encourage you as you see what I'm doing here is if any of you come across any of this stuff, please let me know. Oh, okay. So as I said, what people looked at kindergarten, they saw that educating young children had some value. They were really less interested in the ideas that Froebel had about visual spatial literacy and those kinds of things. They were mostly interested in the reform aspects. So kindergarten became used in numerous different ways. On Ellis Island, for instance, when parents would arrive with their children, they would be separated. The children would go into a kindergarten area where the teachers could advise them about hygiene, about patriotism, all sorts of indoctrination, but for good reasons. It was used by Christian missionaries as a tool in Asia. So a lot of the reason why Froebel is well-known and more well-known in Japan and South Korea is because in the late 1800s, a lot of Christian missionaries went over there, and a lot of young women were doing that work. Yes, it is. It is. It's the Milton Bradley Froebel. So one of the things, and I'm not sure, let me jump ahead and see where the slides are at here, because I want to make a point. Yeah, I think I'll do it now. Up until this point, if you were a young woman, you basically went from your father's house to your husband's house. There were not a lot of roles for you in society. There were no jobs practically. You could be a nurse. There were a few things like that. You could do laundry and such. But when the Froebel Kindergarten hit, suddenly there was an opportunity for ambitious, young, smart women to get into a field where, on the surface, they told you, you might become a more attractive spouse because you'll be trained to work with young children, and therefore a man looking for a mother will, But really what was underneath that was that these women could support themselves. They could operate their own small businesses, and in a lot of cases, that's what they did. They started kindergartens, then later they expanded into training other women in the art of kindergarten teaching, and then in Chicago, for instance, National Louis University was the Chicago Kindergarten Training School, which before that was just simply a kindergarten. And Elizabeth Harrison is the woman that went all the way from a small group of children to running a university. In Grand Rapids, we also had some amazing women. Dr. Frances Rutherford was one of the very first physicians in the country. She was the first city physician in the country. She was the city physician of Grand Rapids. I know some of this text is really small, but she had quite a career. In fact, getting a phenomenal amount of training, and she was very active locally in the establishment of the Ladies Literary Club and other organizations involved in suffrage and women's temperance and all of that. Apparently, she had a very high-profile divorce. I haven't seen the newspaper pages, but apparently every day in the newspaper there was more gossip about what was going on. She apparently did not have a particularly good husband and wasn't afraid to divorce him publicly. So I have to hand it for her. On a medical convention to Boston, remember Boston was where Milton Bradley was, it was where Elizabeth Peabody was. She went there and she met up with a Dr. Monroe and his wife, and they told her about kindergarten. And as soon as she got back to Grand Rapids, they had a meeting of the Ladies Literary Club and discussed bringing kindergarten here. Enos Putnam, James Barnett, Frank B. Graves, Arthur Torrey, these are names that I don't know. Reverend J. Morgan Smith were at that meeting, but once word got out, other names that are even more popular or more known today. Okay. So the first kindergarten opened here in 1873, which was pretty early on. Milton Bradley didn't even hear about the kindergarten until 1869. So it really kind of spread to Grand Rapids fairly quickly. At the beginning of this, what was interesting with Milton Bradley was that they joked about this. In Springfield, Massachusetts, they couldn't initially get people interested in the kindergarten. And so Milton Bradley sponsored what was known as a free kindergarten, a charity kindergarten for the poor children. And they joked about the fact that in Springfield, if you wanted the best education for your children, you had to be poor. But in Grand Rapids, the tuition was fairly high, and it was definitely the children of the wealthy. And then in 1876, they demonstrated the affordable kindergarten at the Philadelphia Exposition. And the story goes with Frank Lloyd Wright that his mother discovered it there. Well, that's not probably true. It's more likely that she was already aware of it, and she went there because she knew there would be demonstrations. This is a stereo piece showing the demonstration building that was there in Philadelphia. Frank Lloyd Wright was a major champion of affordable kindergarten. He actually was a bit older. He was 10, 11 years old when he first got these blocks, but his entire life, he not only educated his own children and neighborhood children with this method, but he considered it to be the reason for his success. In fact, this set of blocks here, Affordable Gift 6, is what he used to design the Larkin building, which is no longer in Buffalo, New York. It was torn down. But he would use these blocks as a scratch pad while he was designing. He would play with them, and he claimed that they were in his fingers, and he could just sort of mentally organize them in his mind. Buckminster Fuller also had a affordable education. He invented the geodesic dome as a 5-year-old in affordable kindergarten. He was nearsighted, and all the other children were working with the peas and toothpicks, and they were making little horses and houses, and he was very frustrated because he couldn't really see what he was doing. So he made a series of triangles and then combined the triangles into a half sphere. And he remembers the incident because all of the adults in the school gathered around. And he couldn't understand why they were so blown away by that particular thing. Then as an adult, as an architect, he continued to build on that. Another historical connection outside of Grand Rapids is the Leland Stanford Memorial Kindergarten, which was the origin of Stanford University. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Stanfords. They were quite wealthy, and Leland had a hobby. He had his own museum, and so in the summertime, his mother and he would go to Europe where he could collect antiquities. She became ill, and then within a few weeks, he became ill, but unfortunately, he didn't survive. I think he was 12 or 13 years old. They were absolutely devastated, and when Mrs. Stanford came back, she got very active in the Golden Gate Kindergarten Association they established for Freuble Kindergarten, and their first educational initiative was this free kindergarten for the poor. I think there were something like 7 or 8 at the Stanford family. Mrs. Stanford partnered with Phoebe Hearst, Mrs. Hearst, of the Citizen Kane Hearst, and they were really a proponent. So you can understand how important Freuble Kindergarten was regarded nationally and internationally, and why Grand Rapids took it so seriously. As I said earlier, a lot of Christian missionaries spread it. It went out of Germany, essentially landed in the United States. When it got popular here, it got popular everywhere. This is a shot from Cuba. I'm not sure if you recognize the title here, but you will recognize the melody. One of the things that happens in a Freuble kindergarten is the children are greeted in the morning with a song, usually. Good Morning to You was written by Patty Smith Hill and her sister Mildred. They were kindergarten teachers. On special days, they would change the words. Instead of Good Morning to You, it would be Happy Birthday to You. One of the parents heard the song one day and decided it might be good in a Broadway show, so they copyrighted it, and the show was very successful. People really enjoyed singing Happy Birthday on their birthdays. And over the last 100 years, it's generated well over $100 million in royalties, much of which have been used to compensate a Freuble organization, which today is called the ACEI, happens to be one of our backers for our documentary. But a lot of people don't realize where the song Happy Birthday came from. It came from the Freuble Kindergarten. Oops. I gave you some background on the social reform, but settlement houses. One of the more famous is the Hull House of Chicago, but Anna Bissell also had settlement houses here in Grand Rapids, and the Freuble Kindergarten was sort of the core of it. They would do home visits. They would help the mothers. And one of the most important aspects, besides providing a job and a career for women, mothers were able to send their children to kindergarten, even if it was half day. I gave them a break. I gave them an ability to catch up on things they needed to do. And so this type of outreach, which was essentially well-to-do women in Grand Rapids helping all women in Grand Rapids through all sorts of different organizations. Another famous way that the kindergarten was put to use was at the Perkins School for the Blind. Freuble Kindergarten can be used at the same table with people of different ages, different abilities. It was a natural for special needs education. Perkins School had a student named Ann Sullivan who was legally blind but not completely blind.